Let's look at permissions for company-managed projects. Company-managed permissions control users' access to the project functionality in company-managed projects. This means, for example, they grant users the ability to administer the project, add comments to issues, browse issues in the project, and many other permissions. Project permissions are applied using permission schemes. A permission scheme can be applied to one project, or a permission scheme could be shared across several projects. One of the main differences between company-managed and team-managed permissions is that permission schemes can be shared by several projects. When you are configuring company-managed Jira projects, project permissions should always be considered within the context of one or multiple projects. The number of permissions listed in a scheme may vary, depending on the applications and apps you have installed. In this example, we see that both Jira Software and Jira Service Management are installed, since we have the Managed Sprints and Service Project Agent permissions. The theory, however, remains the same. Project permissions control what users can or cannot do on a project-by-project basis. Next, we'll consider the importance of impactful permissions, and then we'll look at how these project-level permissions interact with other configurations in Jira. Company-managed project permissions can be categorized into three areas: standalone permissions, interrelated permissions, and permissions that need to meet global prerequisites in order to have an effect. We'll look at what this means next. Let's start with standalone permissions. Most permissions in a permission scheme control a single piece of functionality, such as the ability to create issues. These permissions do not have any cross-impact on other projects or permissions. Let's look at two very important standalone type permissions. First, the Browse Projects permission. This permission is a prerequisite for almost any other permission in a permission scheme. It controls who has access to a project, and consequently who has access to individual issues in that project. It's incredibly powerful. If you can't browse projects, you can't see issues. If you can't see an issue, of course, you can't edit, transition, comment, or do anything with it. Restricting the Browse Projects permission will influence what users will see on dashboards and in filters, and the email notifications that they receive. This means that when you're configuring permission schemes or troubleshooting permissions, or the visibility or notifications from issues, you must always consider the Browse Project permission. Another standalone permission with underlying complexity is the Edit Issues permission. As you might think, it controls who can edit or update an issue, and edit or update the field values of an issue. It's important to remember that if you want to edit a field, it must be present on the screen associated with the relevant edit issue operation. Additionally, the field needs to be editable, and not hidden, in a field configuration. Editing an issue type is a common point of confusion. Issue types can be edited or updated, but the base rule is that the configuration of fields and screens must be either identical or shared between the current issue type and the new issue type. This is something to bear in mind when attempting to change an issue type. Another common configuration that administrators run into is the combination of the Edit Issues permission and workflow properties. Workflow step properties, such as Jira.issue.editable, will make issues read-only, even for users that have the Edit Issues permission. This configuration can also mean that issues cannot be updated in bulk, using the bulk edit issue operation. As you can see, the Edit Issues permission often needs to be analyzed alongside screen schemes, field configuration schemes, and even workflow schemes when planning or troubleshooting a configuration. This brings us to the next permission category, the interrelated permissions. Interrelated permissions are permissions that will not have any effect unless combined with other permissions. They often have cross-project impact, or they will not function unless other prerequisites have been met, such as the user having active product access. Let's look at this in more detail. Take Move Issues, for example. Users will not be able to move an issue to another project if they don't also have the Create Issues permission in the target project. And of course, they will need the Browse Projects permission and the correct security levels, if they are applied, in order to do so. The same goes for linking issues. If you do not have access to the issue, you need to link through the Browse Projects permission and/or applicable issue security levels. you cannot link to that issue. The Schedule Issues permission grants users the ability to edit an issues to date or rank issues on Jira software boards. This means that users can edit the issues, due date, or rank fields. For both actions, users also need the Edit Issues permission, which we just talked about. The next permission, Assign Issues, is directly related to another permission, the Assignable User permission. If the assignable user permission is not granted to anyone, users cannot assign issues because there is no one to assign them to. The last two examples, Service Project Agent and View Development Tools, are project permissions that only apply if you are using the Jira Service Management or Jira software products, and the users have the appropriate product access. Strictly speaking, all interrelated permissions that we talked about have some global or inter-project prerequisites. Nevertheless, there are some project permissions that can be disabled globally. This is the reason they deserve special discussion here. Issue linking and watching and voting are all Jira features that can be globally disabled. If those features are disabled, none of the related permissions will have any impact on projects. With company-managed project permissions, permissions can be granted to groups, project roles, single users, and many other user types in Jira as you see listed here, such as a project lead. The approach to granting user access to a permission in a project is very important. It will determine the flexibility for that permission scheme and the management overhead needed to maintain it. First, let's consider groups and project roles, which are used heavily in configurations in Jira. Groups are used throughout Jira, as shown. There are even some places where only groups can be used and project roles cannot. For example, product access and global permissions. This makes sense. The membership of a role is managed on a project-by-project basis. Granting Jira access to members of a role that exists only inside a Jira project would be an approach that was impossible to maintain. Project roles, on the other hand, can be used in all relevant project schemes. This makes sense since project role membership is defined at the project level, so you always need a project context. If you intend to streamline your administration and keep the overhead low, using project roles and permission schemes is considered best practice. Why? In the use case presented here, users or groups are granted the administer projects permission via membership of the administrator's role. They can decide who will be able to create issues in their projects by associating individual users or groups to the project roles that are granted the Create Issues permission. In our scenario, the consultant's project role is granted the Browse Projects permission in the Business Permission Scheme. That permission scheme is used in multiple HR projects, human resources, onboarding, and internal training. In each of those projects, the project administrator has granted different users or groups the role of consultant. Two consulting users, Ravi and Sue, can browse projects in the Human Resources project. The three consulting users, Sam, Ava, and Nalini, can browse projects in the Onboarding project. And the Internal Training Consultants group can browse projects in the Internal Training project. By using project roles, Jira administrators can use fewer permission schemes. Fewer schemes mean Jira administrators can prevent clutter and share schemes, thus saving on administration overhead. Using roles also reduces the workload on Jira administrators, because project administrators can assign users and groups to the project roles. That means Jira administrators can focus on the tasks that can't be delegated to the project administrators. While using project roles is considered best practice, whether you use project roles or groups in a permission scheme sometimes depends on company guidelines. What you should avoid, however, is granting permissions to single users in a permission scheme. This approach is difficult to maintain and will likely not scale. Understanding permissions is crucial when working in Jira. Understanding their context, whether global project-related or issue type-related, is equally important. Many configuration elements throughout Jira will have an impact on permissions. Let's look at some of those related configuration elements. This overview contains most of the configuration elements that might need to be examined when handling permissions questions or troubleshooting scenarios when working with company-managed projects. You can see that many things need to be taken into consideration when we talk about permissions. Let's look at a few examples. How do fields impact permissions? Well, if an issue security field isn't present on a screen in an issue, then we can't set that field, regardless of the project permission settings for set issue security. So in this case, issue type settings, along with screen schemes and field configurations, must be reviewed. How do workflows impact permissions? Well, if a user is unable to transition an issue, they might have the Transition Issues project permission, but there could be a workflow condition that prevents this. Or there might be a workflow property on a status that's preventing a user from editing an issue in that status. And what about product access? In this case, if a user has the project permission to manage sprints or view development tools, they will not be able to do so or view anything related to sprints or development tools unless they have Jira Software product access.